When I was 14, my parents looked me straight in the eye and told me I was nothing but a burden. My mother's voice was cold as ice when she said, "We can't keep wasting our lives on you." My father didn't argue with her. Instead, he dragged a black trash bag from the closet, stuffed my clothes into it, and shoved it into my arms. The last thing I heard before the door slammed was his words, "You'll figure it out. Or you won't. Either way, you're not our problem anymore." I stood on the sidewalk with everything I owned sagging inside that bag. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. I didn't exist to them anymore. Neighbors peeked from their curtains, whispering, but no one stepped forward. I was 14, hungry, terrified, and completely alone. Years passed. I survived on scraps, worked odd jobs, and fought to build a life they swore I'd never have. I thought the worst was behind me. But then, 12 years later, I walked into my grandfather's funeral, wearing a borrowed suit that barely fit, only to see the same parents who abandoned me pull up in shining luxury cars. They stepped out laughing, their jewelry glittering, acting like they owned the place. And when whispers spread that Grandpa had left behind a $42 million estate, they raised their voices and demanded their share. Everyone turned toward the front of the room when the lawyer opened his folder. My heart pounded as he scanned the faces of my family, then stopped on me. A small smile formed on his lips as he read aloud, "The heir to everything is the one who kept my secret safe." And then he lifted his hand and pointed directly at me. After that night when my parents threw me out, life stopped being about childhood and started being about survival. At 14, while other kids were worrying about math homework or Friday night football games, I was standing on street corners trying to figure out where I would sleep without getting robbed. The first week was the hardest. I carried that trash bag of clothes from block to block, too proud to beg, too scared to ask for help. Hunger gnawed at me so sharply that one night I crouched behind a diner and waited for the cook to toss the garbage bags. I dug through them and pulled out half a sandwich. That was my dinner, and I remember telling myself I'd never forget how it felt to be treated as less than human. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the silence from the people who should have cared. My mother, Clarice, had always been more concerned with appearances than affection. She loved pristine houses, expensive perfumes, and friends who praised her style. To her, children were accessories, and I was a defective one. My father, Damon, was harder to read but sharper in cruelty. He spoke like every word was a judgment. When I brought home grades that weren't perfect, he'd say, "A Callaway should never be average." I never once heard him say he was proud of me. When they cast me out, they didn't just shut the door. They shut down any idea that family meant unconditional love. I had a younger sister, Mira. She was 12 when they made me leave. I still see her face pressed against the upstairs window as I walked down the driveway. She was crying, her small hand tapping against the glass, but my parents pulled her away. That image stayed with me through the darkest nights. Mira was the only person who looked at me like I mattered, but she was trapped in their world, forced to obey their silence. There was only one person who tried to keep some thread of connection alive: my grandfather, Silas Callaway. He was Damon's father, a man with a weathered face and a voice that carried both authority and kindness. Silas was not one for gentle words, but his actions spoke louder than anything. He ran a small chain of businesses and carried himself like a man who built his empire with his bare hands. Most people feared him, but I knew better. He didn't pity me. He respected the fight in me. Every few months, when I was struggling the most, I would catch him watching me from a distance. Once, he slipped me a folded $20 bill with a quick grunt, as if embarrassed to show affection, and said, "Don't waste it." That was his way of caring. Despite the struggles, I found ways to survive. I worked odd jobs at gas stations, washed dishes in diners, shoveled snow in the winters, and mowed lawns in the summers. Each dollar felt like proof that I didn't need Clarice or Damon to exist. School was harder. Some nights I slept on park benches, other nights in shelters, and still I showed up to class. Teachers noticed, but I lied and said everything was fine. Pride kept me from telling anyone the truth. By 16, I had learned how to blend into the background. I didn't complain, didn't ask for more than I earned, and I kept moving forward. I carried the sting of rejection inside me, but it hardened into determination. When people told me I looked tired, I just smiled. When they asked where my parents were, I said they were busy. The truth was, they were too busy pretending I didn't exist. Through all of it, one memory kept me pushing forward. Before he passed, Grandpa Silas once told me, "The measure of a man isn't who stands with him when it's easy. It's who he becomes when no one stands at all." I didn't fully understand it then, but those words became a compass. They reminded me that even though my parents had abandoned me, I had the chance to become something stronger. The years rolled by, and slowly I built a life out of nothing. At 18, I scraped together enough money to rent a tiny room above a hardware store. At 20, I was balancing 2 jobs while taking community college classes at night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I wasn't anyone's burden, I wasn't anyone's mistake, I was surviving, and survival felt like victory. Still, there was always a shadow in the back of my mind. I wondered if Mira remembered me. I wondered if she ever asked about me, or if Clarice and Damon had erased my name from the family completely. I wondered if Grandpa Silas had ever defended me when they spoke ill of me. The questions gnawed at me, but I buried them under work and focus. That is how life was for me before the phone call came. A cousin I barely remembered reached out and told me that Grandpa Silas had passed away. The funeral would be held at the family estate, the same place I hadn't stepped foot in since the night I was cast out. I didn't have much, a borrowed suit, shoes that were too tight, and a car that coughed more than it ran, but I knew I had to be there. For the first time in years, I would face the people who once abandoned me. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew one thing. I would no longer walk into their world as the boy they threw away. I was coming as the man I had fought to become. The morning of the funeral felt heavy from the moment I woke up. My chest tightened as I buttoned the collar of a borrowed shirt that didn't quite fit. I studied myself in the cracked mirror of my room above the hardware store. The man staring back at me looked tired, older than his years, but his eyes carried something my parents had never recognized: resolve. This wasn't just about saying goodbye to my grandfather. This was about walking back into a world that had once thrown me to the curb and showing them that I had survived. When I pulled up to the Callaway estate, the driveway was lined with polished black cars, each one shining as though it had just rolled off the lot. Mercedes, Bentleys, a Rolls-Royce at the front. I parked my sputtering old sedan at the far end, out of sight of the main entrance, and walked up the gravel path. Guests in expensive black suits and glittering jewelry swept past me without recognition. They didn't know who I was, or if they did, they pretended not to. I stepped inside the house I hadn't seen since childhood. The smell of polished wood and cologne hit me, and memories flooded back. I could see myself as a boy running through those same halls, Mira laughing behind me. Now the laughter was gone, replaced with hushed whispers and the faint sound of a string quartet playing near the reception room. At the center of it all was my grandfather's casket, draped in dark velvet, a simple photo resting above it. He looked stern even in that picture, but to me, he looked like the only one who had ever believed I was worth something. Then I saw them. My mother and father entered from the far side of the room, their presence demanding attention. Clarice wore a black dress with pearls around her neck. Her expression calculated sorrow. Damon followed, his posture straight, his suit tailored perfectly, his eyes scanning the room like a man assessing his worth by the people he could control. Behind them was my Uncle Rhett, broad-shouldered, loud even in silence, his smirk betraying the greed already at work in his mind. They spotted me almost instantly. Clarice's lips tightened as if she had tasted something bitter. She leaned toward Damon and muttered something I couldn't hear, but his response came sharp and clear. He shouldn't even be here. His words weren't directed at me, but they cut as if they were. I walked toward the casket, ignoring the stairs. When I reached it, I placed my hand on the polished wood. For a moment, it was just me and him. "Thank you for never forgetting me," I whispered under my breath. As I turned, Mira appeared at the edge of the room. She was 24 now, grown into the young woman I had only imagined she would become. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and for a second I saw the same little sister who had pressed her hand against the glass the night I left. She didn't come closer, though. My parents' presence kept her still. Her silence was loud, but her eyes told me everything. I had been missed. The ceremony began and the pastor spoke about Silas's hard work, his accomplishments, his legacy. I listened, but my focus drifted to the rows of faces, each one waiting for what would come next. Not the prayers, not the eulogies. Everyone was waiting for the will. When the service ended, the lawyer, Mr. Hayes, stepped forward. He was a tall man with graying hair, his black suit crisp, his movements precise. He carried a thick folder in his hands, and the room shifted instantly. Conversations quieted. Even the air seemed to hold still. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. "As executor of Silas Calloway's estate, I will now read the provisions of his will." His voice carried authority, and every head turned toward him. My Uncle Rhett leaned back in his chair with a grin. "Finally," he muttered. Damon straightened his tie, Clarice dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief she didn't need, and Mira sat frozen. I stayed near the back, my hands in my lap, pretending I wasn't shaking inside. The lawyer began listing small bequests, donations to charities, gifts to longtime employees, minor properties given to distant relatives. The tension in the room grew thicker with each line. Everyone was waiting for the final announcement, the fortune that would define the Calloway name for decades to come. Finally, Mr. Hayes paused. He shuffled the papers deliberately, and his eyes swept across the room. "As for the majority of my estate," he read, his tone deliberate, $42 million in assets, businesses, and properties, I leave it all to one person. But only one. Clarice leaned forward. Damon's jaw tightened. Rhett's smirk widened. Mira's eyes darted nervously around the room. Mr. Hayes continued. "The heir to everything will not be the one who demanded the most, nor the one who carries my name the loudest. The heir will be the one who kept my secret safe." Confusion rippled through the crowd. Rhett frowned. Damon snapped his head toward the lawyer. Clarice whispered sharply, "What does that mean?" Mr. Hayes closed the folder with care, then looked up. His gaze swept over the room once more until it landed on me. He smiled, subtle but undeniable, and then he raised his hand and pointed directly at my chest. Gasps erupted. Damon shot to his feet. "This is a mistake," he barked. Clarice clutched her pearls, shaking her head furiously. Rhett slammed his fist against the arm of his chair. Every eye turned toward me. My chest tightened, my pulse roared in my ears, but I didn't flinch. For the first time in years, I wasn't the boy they had thrown away. I was the one who held the key to a secret none of them understood. The room erupted after the lawyer pointed at me. My father's voice cut through the noise first, sharp and furious. "This is absurd. That boy hasn't been a part of this family for over a decade. How could he possibly be the heir?" My Uncle Rhett joined in, his tone mocking. "Come on, Hayes. Don't play games. Everyone knows Silas would never hand over $42 million to a castaway." My mother's face twisted with fury. She clutched my father's arm and hissed, "Damon, stop this nonsense right now." Her voice trembled, not with grief, but with fear of losing what she believed was rightfully hers. The lawyer stayed calm, adjusting his glasses before answering. "Mr. Calloway, this was your father's wish. The will is clear. The one who inherits is the one who kept his secret safe. Then, looking directly at me again, he asked, "Aaron, do you still have the box your grandfather gave you?" Gasps circled the room. My father's face reddened with rage, but the words froze me in place. For a second, the funeral hall seemed to vanish, and I was back in a freezing alley 12 years earlier. I was 15, huddled beneath a broken fire escape, my breath visible in the winter air. My stomach ached from hunger, my hands raw from the cold. That night, I had nearly given up, nearly convinced myself that I would never make it to adulthood. Then I heard footsteps echoing against the brick walls. "Boy?" a familiar voice called. I looked up and saw him, Grandpa Silas, wrapped in his heavy coat, standing taller than I had seen him in months. His eyes studied me with a mixture of disappointment and something deeper, something like pride. "You're tougher than they'll ever admit," he said. He knelt in front of me, his hands rough but steady as he placed a wooden box in my lap. The box was about the size of a shoebox, worn at the corners, its brass lock gleaming faintly under the streetlight. "Inside this box is something worth more than money," he told me. "You must not open it until the time is right. Promise me, Aaron, guard this with your life. If you keep this safe, then one day you'll understand why I chose you." I stared at him, shivering, too weak to argue. "Why me?" I asked. His answer was simple. "Because you are the only one I trust. They want what I have, but you've never wanted anything from me except love. That makes you stronger than all of them." I nodded, clutching the box with both hands. "I promise." For years, I carried that box everywhere. It moved with me from shelter to shelter, from rundown rooms to cheap apartments. There were nights when I thought of pawning it just to eat, but the promise held me back. Each time I looked at it, I remembered the weight of Silas's words. Keeping the box safe became my anchor, the proof that even when the world turned its back on me, someone believed I was worth trusting. The memory faded, and I was back in the funeral hall, all eyes locked on me. Slowly, I reached under the chair where I had hidden my satchel. From inside, I pulled out the same wooden box, still intact after all those years. The brass lock shone under the chandelier light. Gasps filled the air again, louder this time. My father lunged forward. "That doesn't prove anything. He could have stolen it." Mr. Hayes raised a hand. "No, Damon. Your father documented everything. He entrusted this box to Aaron. He told me himself that the contents would reveal who truly honored his last wish." Clarice's voice cracked. "This is madness. We raised him, we sacrificed for him, and he abandoned us. How dare you reward betrayal?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel small under her gaze. My voice was steady when I replied. "You didn't sacrifice for me. You threw me away because I wasn't convenient. Grandpa was the only one who treated me like I mattered. I made him a promise, and I kept it." The room went silent. My Uncle Rhett folded his arms, his face sour with resentment. Mira shifted uncomfortably, her eyes moving between me and our parents, her lips pressed tight as if holding back words she wanted to speak. Mr. Hayes stepped closer. "Aaron, do you wish to open it now?" I hesitated. The box felt heavier than it ever had before. For years it had been my burden and my shield. Part of me feared what was inside. What if it was empty? What if my grandfather's words had been nothing more than a test I had barely passed? But I felt his presence in that moment, and I knew this was why I had carried the weight for so long. "Yes," I said firmly. "It's time." My father scoffed and turned away, but I noticed his fists clenched tight at his sides. My mother whispered under her breath, "This can't be happening." As I placed the box on the lawyer's table, the air in the room thickened. Relatives leaned forward, waiting to see what would be revealed. The polished wood reflected the dim light, and for a moment everything felt suspended, as if the entire family's future balanced on the turn of a small brass key. Mr. Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out that key. He looked at me, his eyes steady. "Your grandfather gave me this to keep, with instructions that it would only ever open in your hands." "Are you ready?" I nodded. My pulse thundered in my ears. The moment of truth was finally here. The room held its breath as Mr. Hayes set the brass key into the lock. My hands trembled as I placed both palms on the wooden box, steadying it. For 12 years, I had carried this weight. It had followed me through freezing nights, through hunger, through despair. Now, at the center of my family's eyes, it was about to open. The lock clicked. Slowly, the lid creaked upward, and inside lay a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges, along with a folded envelope sealed in red wax. Gasps rose from every corner of the room. My father took a step forward, his face twisted in disbelief. "That's it? A box of papers?" Mr. Hayes lifted the journal with care. "These are the writings of Silas Calloway, your father, your grandfather. His reflections, his accounts, and his truths. He instructed that the contents be read aloud only if Aaron presented this box intact." Clarice's voice cracked, sharp with contempt. "This is theater. Silas would never give power to that boy. This is a manipulation." The lawyer ignored her. He opened the journal and began to read. The words were unmistakably Silas's, his voice echoing through the ink on the page. "To my family, I leave these words. Over the years, I built a fortune from nothing. I built a legacy meant to endure. But money is not the true measure of worth. Character is, and character is revealed not by greed, but by loyalty and sacrifice." The room shifted. Damon sneered. Rhett crossed his arms. Mira leaned forward with wide eyes. Hayes continued. "To my eldest son Damon, I leave nothing. You betrayed my trust when you stole from the company to cover your debts. To my brother Rhett, I leave nothing. You sought only to outshine me, but never once sought to honor the Calloway name. To Clarice, who married into this family, I leave nothing, for your heart has always been ruled by vanity, not love." Clarice gasped as though the words had struck her like a slap. She turned to Damon. "He is lying. Tell me he is lying." Damon's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Mr. Hayes read on. "To my granddaughter Mira, I leave the hope that she may one day free herself from the chains of her parents' cruelty. But to my grandson Aaron, I leave everything. Because when the world abandoned him, he did not abandon me. He kept my secret safe." Hayes unfolded the sealed envelope and held it high before opening it. Inside were documents, legal titles, account information, the sum of the Calloway fortune. He laid them out across the table and the room erupted into chaos. My father stormed toward the table, his voice booming. "This is a farce. You expect me to believe that the old man would cut me out and hand everything to him?" He was senile. He was manipulated. Hayes's voice remained calm. "Your father had this notarized 3 years ago. Every document is valid. There is no contest." Rhett slammed his hand against the back of a chair. "I'll take this to court. No way I walk away empty-handed, while the boy who was thrown out like trash walks away with millions." Hayes looked at him sharply. "You can try. But the evidence of your misdeeds is in this journal. Fraud, theft, betrayal. The court will see who your father believed in and who he did not." Clarice turned on me then, her eyes burning. "You ruined this family. Do you hear me, Aaron? You ruined us." My voice rose, steadier than I thought it could be. "No, you ruined this family the night you decided I was nothing. Grandpa didn't choose me because of money. He chose me because I was the only one who'd never betrayed him." For the first time, Mira's voice broke the silence. "He's right." She stood, her hands shaking. "All these years you told me Aaron was gone. You told me he was weak, but he was stronger than all of us. Grandpa saw it, and now I see it too." Clarice spun toward her. "Sit down, Mira. You don't know what you're saying." But Mira didn't sit. She walked toward me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. I wanted to. I was scared." I nodded, my throat tight. "You were a child. None of this was your fault." The lawyer cleared his throat once more. "It is final. The estate, the businesses, the accounts, all of it now belongs to Aaron Calloway. That is the will of Silas Calloway, and it will be honored." The silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. My parents stood frozen, their empire crumbling around them. My uncle's face flushed red with impotent rage, and for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of their power shift onto my shoulders. As the reality set in, Clarice clutched Damon's arm and hissed, "We'll find a way to undo this." Damon said nothing, but the look in his eyes promised a war that was already lost. They turned and stormed out of the hall, their designer shoes clicking against the polished floor like a retreating army. Rhett lingered long enough to point a finger at me. "You think this makes you one of us? You'll regret this. You'll regret ever opening that box." Then he, too, stormed away. I stood there, the journal still open in Hayes's hand, the weight of my grandfather's words pressing into me like a crown I had never asked for. Mira stood beside me now, and for the first time in years, I felt what it meant to not be alone. The boy they had thrown away had become the man who carried everything they wanted, and more importantly, the man who carried the truth. When the last of them left the hall, silence fell heavy over the room. The string quartet had stopped playing. The only sound was the steady shuffling of papers as Mr. Hayes packed away the documents that now bore my name. My hands rested on the polished wood of the box, the same box I had carried for 12 years, and for the first time, it felt light. Mira stood beside me. Her voice was soft, almost unsure. "I always wanted to write you, Aaron. I wanted to find you. But every time I tried, Mom and Dad told me it would only hurt me. They said you didn't care about us anymore." I looked at her, seeing not the little girl from the window, but the woman she had become. "I never stopped caring, Mira. Not for a single day. They wanted to erase me, but I remembered you every time I wondered if I could keep going. You were the reason I kept fighting." Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Then maybe we can start again." I nodded, feeling a warmth I hadn't known in years. "Yes, we can start again." Mr. Hayes approached, placing the journal in my hands. "Your grandfather was a hard man, but he was not blind. He saw through greed. He saw who truly had honor. He wanted you to know that you were never forgotten, no matter what anyone else told you." I opened the journal once more and read the final line aloud. "My heir is the one who understood that trust is worth more than gold." The words sank deep into me. They weren't just an inheritance. They were absolution. As I walked out of the estate with Mira at my side, the winter sun was breaking through the clouds. It cast light across the driveway where hours earlier my parents had paraded in their luxury cars. Now those cars were gone, leaving only silence. For the first time in years, I felt no anger toward them. They had tried to bury me, but in doing so they proved what I had always known. Family is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by love, loyalty, and truth. In the weeks that followed, the world changed. Lawyers transferred accounts. Papers were signed. Properties shifted under my name. Headlines even whispered about the Calloway fortune moving to the grandson no one had spoken of in years. My parents tried to contest, but the evidence in the journal shut every door they opened. My uncle's threats faded into silence once his own misdeeds came to light. But the greatest change wasn't in the bank accounts or the business boardrooms. It was in me. For the first time, I wasn't fighting just to survive. I was living with purpose. I remembered the boy who had once eaten from trash bags, shivering in alleys, carrying a box he didn't understand. That boy had kept his promise, and that promise had become the foundation of everything I now held. Mira visited often. She helped me sort through the journal, reading stories about Silas that made us laugh and cry. She confessed her regrets, and I assured her that none of this was her fault. We were rebuilding something together, something that had been broken but not lost. And in quiet moments I sat alone with the journal, running my fingers across my grandfather's words. I thought of what he had given me. Not just money, not just property, but the truth that my worth had never depended on the approval of those who abandoned me. My worth had always been in the promises I kept, the integrity I held when no one was watching. Looking back now, I realize that the inheritance was never about the fortune. It was about vindication. It was about showing that resilience and loyalty could outlast betrayal. It was about proving that the boy cast aside as a burden could rise to stand taller than those who tried to erase him. So, here's the lesson I carry, the one I want you to remember. You may feel abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten, but your value is not defined by those who fail to see it. Your value is defined by the promises you keep, by the fight you refuse to give up, by the love you choose to protect even when the world turns away. When I signed the final papers and placed my name on the inheritance, I didn't feel revenge. I felt peace. Because in the end, I didn't just gain a fortune. I gained back my voice, my dignity, and the knowledge that I had never been the burden they claimed I was. And as I look forward now, I know one thing with certainty. The greatest inheritance my grandfather left me was not the money, but the reminder that loyalty, resilience, and truth are worth more than $42 million. That is my story. If it touched you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, I ask you to share it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone, someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think, because I want to hear your stories too. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me keep sharing the truth about survival, resilience, and the lessons life teaches in the hardest ways. Thank you for listening.